remember how confident you were when you were not quite 20 years old? For a 19-year-old college dropout folk singer from Minnesota, confidence was something he didn't lack. He decided he was going to make a go at it in New York City, which was then known as a jazz town, not a folk city. His name? Robert Zimmerman, but you probably know him better as Bob Dylan. Today's guest is KG Miles, the author of Bob Dylan and the Big Apple, Troubador Tales of New York. KG will tell you that he's just a fan, but he's a fan who's a hell of a good storyteller. He zoomed in from London for this fun conversation, so let's get started. Here's my conversation with Keith KG Miles. Okay, do you have your pint? I brought my pint. I never drink at noon, not since college, but cheers.
There you go. I thought the closest I could get to relevant was a brew called Elvis Juice.
I like it.
Which is very fine, but is very strong.
Okay. If you nod off, I'll yell.
Yeah.
Well, Keith, thanks so much for joining me on Trading Force. I think a really good place to start is, I read your book and really enjoyed it. And obviously it's all about Bob Dylan, but I think in a way it's really a love letter to New York City and especially to Greenwich Village. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally. I think I'd go even further than that. I think it's a love letter to the people in Greenwich Village, particularly at that time. As you know, I was lucky enough to get an endorsement from Stevie Van Zandt, who actually bizarrely put it into a nutshell that, at that time, Greenwich Village in the early 60s was the cultural center of the world. And, I'm pretty convinced that if Bob Dylan had turned up there 2 years earlier or 2 years later, life would have been different and his career would have been very different because, he hit Greenwich Village at the time when, people like Ramblin' Jack Elliott and Cisco Houston and, these wonderful old folkies had paved the way. They'd set up the folk scene that was there, and it was lively and it was vibrant, and as opposed to London, it was very welcoming. Bob Dylan was he had this whole sort of waif and stray Charlie Chaplin-esque sort of way about him, but he was allowed into people's homes. He slept on their sofas. They took him for haircuts. They welcomed him in onto the stages, and he could develop there really well. And it was the right time for someone to come out of that creative maelstrom. It was the right time for a star to come out, and it could have been any number of them. The reality is that Bob Dylan is not a once in a lifetime talent, a once in almost anyone's lifetime talent. This particular artist, manages to soak up every amount of artistic and creative influence around them and come up with the most fantastic music and wonderful lyrics. And people quite early on in Greenwich Village realized that he was quite a talent. They knew, anyone you talk to, and the people I'd interviewed that I wanted for the book, Terry Thal, his first manager, who was a wonderful influence on him. John Wynne, another old folkie from the time. They all say they kind of knew straight away, he was good. He would like tap away at the typewriter and up comes Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Now, that's way beyond what these guys and gals were doing at the time.
He was like 19 or 20, right? I mean, he was so young.
He was just out of his teens, and he was in such a rush, to make the most of the opportunities he got. He was, as I say, an affable character. People liked him there. He had the right amount of arrogance for his talent. Actually, no, he didn't, because he had as the same amount of arrogance for his talent. He'd be the most arrogant person in the world. His talent was formidable. but he managed to get the balance absolutely right in Greenwich Village. And it's a love letter to those people. It's a love letter to people like Peter Lafarge and Karen Dalton, and the most fantastic set of creative people. And I think I'll quote in the book, I think it's Liam Clancy said that, once they saw that Bob Dylan was going to make it and was going to be the star, they knew that was it. It was all up for the rest of them.
Right.
This was the big star going to come out of Greenwich Village, and very much the right one. Although, having said that, it was important for me to have people like Karen Dalton's story in the book. These are hugely talented individuals who have got a really tiny footnote in musical history, and I genuinely think should be listened to, and should be feted for the wonderful artists that they were. And it was, that was an important part of what I wanted from a book about New York.
Well, I think it's really important, and I think you did a really nice job. It's a certain ecosystem, right? That it's a combination of things. You've got a bunch of really interesting players there at the time, and you listed some of them. You've got people who are letting Bob literally sleep on their couch for months, so he has a very nurturing kind of ecosystem of people who support him and are very nice to him. You have a city that, Greenwich Village was a funky area, but New York has always been, there's kind of that funky thing that they like people coming in. You've got John Hammond at one point, who is the same guy that was Billie Holiday and Count Basie here in Kansas City. Later, he's going to discover, or when he signed Bruce Springsteen and Stevie Ray Vaughan and all. So it's like this perfect, what you said, like it's this perfect storm of situation and circumstances. It works out so well for him. And it all started because he wanted to meet Woody Guthrie, right? That's why he initially came to New York.
Yeah, no. That was the plan. It was basically a pilgrimage to see Woody Guthrie. I think he also realized that New York artistically was the place he had to go to be a musician and to do this thing seriously. And the other thing you found in Greenwich Village, which was pretty unique, really, I think, that at that time, was that people could reinvent themselves. He could be a nice Jewish lad from Minnesota and come into New York and give himself a different persona, as Ramblin' Jack Elliott did. It's the amusing story about when he found out that Ramblin' Jack Elliott was really also another Jewish guy called Elia Adnapos. They were all reinventing themselves. They're all, it was like a sort of creative, artistic version of the Foreign Legion. Brent, you could go in, no one worried about your background or your history, and you started from scratch with a stage presence, and that really suited him, because he didn't have the real folky, bluesy credentials. He came from a very nice, ordinary Jewish family, and it was a nice upbringing, and there was no suffering and working in the cotton fields or anything of that
Right.
kind for him. So he didn't have the credentials, essentially, but he could come in and he took to it beautifully, and he could become Bob Dylan as opposed to Robert Zimmerman, and that was important to him. And I don't think there's many places you could do that, or many times you could do that, but certainly early 60s Greenwich Village, it wasn't a problem because everyone was doing it, essentially.
Yeah. And then you've got the Village Voice there, all these great writers that are around. Don't you wish you could have been a fly on the wall and just sat there and listen one night?
An absolutely wonderful time to have been able to to live in the village in that early 60s period, which was its heyday. It had wonderful times sort of since. One of the surprising parts of researching the book was finding a character like George Margolin, who originally Greenwich Village had been a very bohemian, writing and other artistic sort of center. You know, it wasn't a musical center really at all. And you know, I found it extraordinary that you know, in the square, you know, George Margolin was a folk singer who wasn't part of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie's People's Songs, but suddenly took it upon himself to start singing in the square and started that whole tradition. And you know, Pete Seeger was a smart enough guy to think, well, look, do you know what, actually, come on, we can, you know, they were sitting in rooms talking about folk songs and writing down folk songs, you know, not going out and performing. And suddenly this guy, you know, George Margolin should have his own statue there, in my view. You know, he just suddenly decided, I'm going to perform. And the whole musical aspect to Greenwich Village is almost can almost be traced to that Sunday, really, you know, and a random act, you know, because very soon Pete Seeger decided, well, look, we'll get a license to sort of play out, and you know, suddenly then the coffee bars and other things, and you're talking post-war here, you know, well ahead of the 60s, you know, suddenly you've got places thinking, well, you know, okay, we'll have music in, and you know, it really took off. You know, if Bob had arrived at that time, there would have been no scene for him to go to.
Yeah,
you know,
New York was a jazz town. I mean, that was what it was all about. Monk and earlier Bird and all those guys before. It wasn't known as a folk capital.
Yeah, no, the folk scene sort of starts really from there. And you know, Bob Dylan, when he arrived, knew exactly where he could go to. He knew the clubs he could play in. He knew, you know, where he needed to head to, and you know, he'd be, you know, straight to Cafe Wild Gertie's. You know, you know, you could turn up to these sorts of things. So it was all set up for him, really. And having, you know, a little bit of the tales of the pioneers of this, like George Margolin in the book, was pretty nice to have on the research side of everything.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. You and I are both old enough. We remember the world before the internet.
Oh,
so right. So
how did we live?
I know. But think about, you're just basically a kid. You're just now an adult coming, like you said, from the sticks of Minnesota. There was he couldn't get on and check it out ahead of time. I mean, it was all word of mouth and things that he'd heard from other musicians and stuff. But that's a big leap to make. I mean, that takes a lot of guts to go do that.
Oh, absolutely. And he, you know, as I said, it was the welcoming side of Greenwich Village at the time. It was the families that took him in, like the Mackenzies and various others. You know, you know, if he hadn't been incredibly looked after, you know, through that time, what would he do? You know, he got, you know, it was a fine time to arrive, but boy, did he make the most of it. You know, I mean, Bob Dylan has enormous talent, but what he also has in huge abundance is luck. You know, but he makes the best of it. You know, wherever he is, he really does capitalize on the opportunities he's given. You know, others don't. I mean, there are, you know, through the Big Apple book, there are kind of tragedies, if you like, of people who haven't really been able to make the best of their talent. And for every Bob Dylan who comes out and becomes a major international star, there are dozens and dozens who really don't come out of that scene. And a lot of them, you know, didn't survive for terribly long after. You know, there is a lot of tragedy in the book, really. And you know, I wanted to tell some of their tales. Like I say, you know, Karen Dalton springs to mind because I think, you know, we know that Bob Dylan was a big fan of Karen Dalton, and she was a very special talent. And you know, I mean, to me, she's like the Janis Joplin of folk singing, really. I mean, an extraordinary voice, and an extraordinary voice in one way because of an abusive husband who'd knocked her front teeth out. You know, this was the kind of times we're talking about here. You know, but her life went in the opposite direction to Bob Dylan's. You know, they shared a stage in those early sort of days, but you know, they went in different directions, and that was the same for a lot of the artists.
Oh yeah, yeah. Music's a tough business, man.
Oh,
It's a horribly tough business.
Absolutely.
I really, you know, I'm a history nerd anyway. I've been to New York a bunch, and I like that you brought the historical component to it as well. Not just about folk, like we said that, you know, Willa Cather was in Greenwich Village. You know, all these great writers, Dylan Thomas, all these people. But I appreciated that you talked about the fact, because every time I'm in Washington Square Park in New York, I always think this used to be a pauper's grave, and I'm probably standing on the bones of about 20,000 people. It just seems kind of weird that this is park and people are playing music and stuff and like that. And it's kind of a creepy place if you sat and thought about it.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, being a sort of Londoner, I grew up in a place called in South London called Mortlake, which obviously is Dead Lake. You're living on a plague pit of bodies, and you know, I kind of think with history, you forget sometimes, you know, what history you're almost literally living on at times. But it, you know, and you know, that particular part of New York, I think that, you know, there is it's really is steeped with history. I mean, I touched on the kind of bohemian times before the folk scene, but you know, there's you know, there are great books to be written on some of those times still, really. You know, it's a fascinating, rich history.
Yeah, and I think even if you just have a cursory knowledge of Bob Dylan, the visual you're gonna have is the Free Willin' Bob Dylan album, right, with him and Susie on his arm in Greenwich Village. Like, that's just it's the backdrop. I know John Lennon, like, he saw that and wanted to hear it, and, you know, kind of emulated Bob for a while. Some of the Beatles songs of that period are very Dylan-esque. It's just,
I mean, the Beatles said they played that album to death. You know, it was a very important sort of album to them, and we kind of take it a little bit for granted that, you know, there are such wonderful songs on there from someone that's just out of their teens. It's extraordinary. And I think that cover is one of the finest album covers in music history. You know, I think the irony, and again, I touch on this in the book, is that you know, it's essentially that's a depiction of young love that everyone knows. You know, it looks so beautiful, but you know, the reality is that they're kind of huddling together because it's a bloody cold day,
right.
And also the reality is that the relationship was over by that time. You know, this is not young love in its finest glory. This is the end of a relationship. You know, I mean, you have the songs on there, you know, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, etc. You know, you get that, and you know, this is the first sort of real indication of Bob Dylan being the you know, the anti-romantic, if you like. You know, he writes some of the greatest Bob songs about love and going wrong, and than anyone. And you know that, you know, Susie and Bob were kind of history by that particular point, which I think it makes it quite sad, really. Maybe we shouldn't think of it like that. Maybe we should look at it.
Wasn't so free willing, was it? Oh my goodness. So for you and I have known each other. Twitter usually sucks. Let's be honest. A lot of it's bile and horribleness and awfulness. But you know, for the people that don't know, the Premier League came on here in America about 12 years ago, probably. And you're gonna probably punch the screen, but it's always free here. Like, you know, you can watch every match you want. It's just on NBC here.
Yeah.
And I just was like, if I'm gonna get into this, I need to find a team to root for, because if you don't really have a rooting interest, what do you stuff? So long story short, my family originally was from Kent, and I'm talking like 400 years ago, the Greens were. And so I kind of like, well, who do people in Kent like cheer for and stuff? So long, I became Crystal Palace. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be Crystal Palace was, you know, I'm an American and kind of a dope, you know, red, white, and blue, check. Eagles, check. Cheerleaders, check. But they're not a front runner. So I'm not like, you know, where people from England like say, oh, I'm a Yankees fan. I was like, yeah, sure you are. Because, you know, right? So it's kind of fun to do. So that's how you and I connected, which is it's a cool way to connect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, 99% of Twitter is you know, and particularly the political side is horrid. I mean, one thing you don't want to know is what's inside every person's head, and that's what you get with something like Twitter, which is appalling. You know, but there are two sections. You know, and I think it was described as Twitter was described as you build your own room and then you go into the room and shout and run out again. And that's kind of right, because you build the room you want. And I'm absolutely convinced of this. The two finest sets of people you can have in that room are Bob Dylan fans and Crystal Palace fans. You know, I think essentially two of the finest sets of people in on God's earth. And very, very, you know, I mean, God, we bicker like any families, but you know, but you couldn't find a nicer, more supportive set of people, you know, and smart. You know, I mean, look, there's kind of, you could have picked a lot of football teams where you wouldn't have very smart fans. You know, we are incredibly smart fans, and yeah, I'd say supportive. I mean, the Bob Dylan Twitter side, which has been fantastic. You know, practically it's been fantastic for me because, you know, for example, for the first book I did, Bob Dylan in London, you know, Jackie and I, we went to university and, you know, we set up the Dylan room at the Troubadour, and we kind of thought, well, there are so many nice stories and so much we want to guide people around. We wanted to write a book, and we had no intention of doing anything other than publishing it ourselves. But through Dylan Twitter, the publishers came to us and said, that looks really interesting. You look like you've got a fun thing to do there that people might want. And, you know, through both books, you know, the main ethos, other than getting across the joy of Bob Dylan, you know, I got a room next door with, oh, God knows how many hundreds of Bob Dylan books. And boy, are a lot of them turgid and pseudo academic and dreadful. And you know, Bob Dylan is a really fun person, you know, and the music is wonderfully joyous as well. You know, there is so much depth, there is so much to it. And I wanted, you know, a readable Bob Dylan book, one that someone who didn't know too much about Bob Dylan could actually still enjoy. And you know, that's important to me. You know, the best review I had for the Big Apple book was that it was refreshingly non-academic.
Yeah.
You know, which is, I love that every time. You know, that's wonderful. You know, you know, there is a lot that's written about Bob Dylan that is, like I say, pretty hard to read. You know, I mean, there are authors on Bob Dylan who, you know, when you get to the end of the sentence, you can't remember what happened at the beginning. You know, it's really it's quite important to me to be a readable, an easily readable author about this subject. You know, because it's a great subject. I don't want to put people off.
Yeah. Which a lot, like you said, there's a lot of books that do that, where it just looks like he used a such and such guitar and his strings were, you know, 12 gauge strings and he tuned and blah, blah, blah. And it's like people just like check out because who cares?
Yeah.
I mean,
or more importantly, which there are many books on. You know, the books of Michael Gray I love about the lyrics, and that's fine. But you know, there are. I don't want a whole book about how Bob Dylan is like King Lear. You know, or you know, and I look at some of them and I think, you know, what are you going on about? You know, sometimes Gibraltar just rhymes with altar. You know, that's, get over it. You know, it's, you know, he's still a songwriter, you know, and you know, I'm sure Bob Dylan must sit there in Malibu and chuckle at some of these and think, oh, you know, I've
a
no
lot
idea.
of it.
Yeah, I've no idea how you've come to that conclusion about that song, because, you know, we've got to be a bit realistic about the process and about what he does. And you know, like I say, I think it's important to me that and also it's the things that interest me are the things, as we were talking about the Big Apple book. It's the people around, it's the scene around Bob Dylan. It's you know, where his music comes from in terms of circumstances and people and places. That's important to me.
And I think it almost seems like the perfect way for somebody who wasn't looking for your book. They go to New York, they're in Greenwich Village in a coffee shop, let's say, and your book's just sitting there, and they're like, oh, that kind of looks like, and they pick it up, and it's almost like a little mini Fromers, because you've got the map in the back, you've got the pictures, you've got not only where the bar is currently in 2022 now, but where it was when Bob was playing there. And it's like this nice little companion piece that people who love to travel, like I love to travel, it's kind of a way to put that history in perspective and give you something like, oh, I didn't know that's, you know, where Bob first stayed, or the townhouse that he lived in where the nut was telling him that he sold out and chased him down the street, like all those cool stories, right?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I was really surprised. What surprises me more than anything is that, you know, and for want of a better phrase, music tourism is not a big thing. You know, the one of the huge impetus for Jackie and I writing the Bob Dylan in London book was that people didn't know. You know, it was 2020, and there were people in this world that didn't know that the video to Subterranean Homesick Blues was shot at the back of the Savoy Hotel. You know, this is wrong. You know, and you know, and there aren't plaques, and you know, London and New York are the same. They're not good at really showing their history and really enjoying the history. You know, people, you know, going around. The only place that's done very well, and that's only in recent times, is Liverpool with the Beatles. You know, 20 years ago, it was exactly the same. You'd go to Liverpool and you wouldn't be able to find anywhere much that they played, you know, and what happened or where they lived. You know, now it's awash with plaques and museums and tours and everything else, which is fine. But you know, London is awfully bad at celebrating, you know, one of the finest pop musical traditions you will find anywhere. You know, we do Bob Dylan in London tours. We take people around and we do that, and the guy that does that will do David Bowie and the Kinks and others, and it's, you know, it's starting to happen. But you know, the guidebooks weren't there. You know, when the publishers said to me, we'd like the second Troubadour Tales book to be about New York, I thought, crikey, you know, my heart sank a little. Number one, because there are a lot of books about Bob Dylan in New York, or lots of that time is really reflected in a lot of books. The other problem was I couldn't get to New York because
Right.
it was a big practical problem. You know, and thankfully I was blessed with really good researchers out there. You know, I knew a lot of New Yorkers who were Bob Dylan fans, and you know, I managed to get those guys and girls to get out to the places, because it had to be the same as London. It had to be a good guide. It had to understand the city and what Bob Dylan was in the city. And I couldn't practically do that. You know, I needed that sort of help, you know, just at the moment. But there were certain things I, as a Bob Dylan fan, wanted in a New York book. And I was blessed. You know, I mean, you talk about the crazy guy that wrestled Bob Dylan. You know, I wanted AJ Weberman in this book.
Yeah, you interviewed him.
Yeah,
you did like a little mini chapter with him.
Yeah, he's the pantomime villain of Bob Dylan in New York. You know, he really is, you know, seen in that way. But you know, for that early 70s time, you know, he's critical to you know, the Bob Dylan story, where Dylan took things, you know, his attitude to different things. And, you know, he wrestled with Bob Dylan on the floor in New York, you know, on the sidewalk. You know, it's got to go in the book. And I, you know, and he's a fascinating guy. You know, he's crazy as a bag of spanners, you know, clearly, but it's wonderful because he's basically just a Bob Dylan fan who's like, who we could all be guilty of this, is taking things just that bit too far with everything. And I wondered how I was going to interview this guy because, you know, he's getting on a bit as well. And again, it was through Twitter. I thought, well, I'll contact someone. He's going to know an email or something, or the way into AJ Weberman. And my contact came back to me and said, yeah, just give us your number and he'll give you a ring. And it was as simple as that. And I had a very long conversation with him. And he talked a lot of sense. You know, he was saying, you know, again, we were talking about the nonsense that's written about Bob Dylan half the time in books. And he was saying, look, you know, I lived through that time. I was there with Dylan. I lived the places. I went to the places. You know, I know where heating pipes cough. I know the things he's talking about and where it kind of comes from. And I understood that. And I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, he was, I also wanted to ask him the kind of things I wanted to ask. I expected at some point he would like hang up the phone on me, you know, if I asked the wrong thing. But he was very good. He was very apologetic about, you know, the times he hassled the family and stuff like that. You know, he knew he was wrong. He knew he took things too far. There was a not exactly a love-hate relationship between him and Dylan, you know, but Bob was sensible enough to know, do you know what, this is all good for publicity, you know, and I think he said to AJ Weberman at one point, you know, no one was buying John Wesley Harding until stuff came up and they're like flying off the shelves, you know.
Right.
You know, it was good and it was interesting, but he was one of a small number of people that I really did want in the book. You know, I had to have Scarlett Revere in there because I think, you know, that's mid-70s New York Dylan, isn't it? That's that whole desire, and then the start of the Rolling Thunder Review, you know, that tour coming out of there. That's fabulous. That's got to be in there. And as I said before, you know, I was blessed with interviewing Terry Thal, who is essentially Bob Dylan's first manager, and with Susie Rotolo and Dave Van Ronk, who was Terry's partner. You know, the four of them would sit up at night and play cards and talk about literature and politics and everything else. You know, the kind of creative and intellectual part of Dylan's life and his music from there on, it was kind of forged in those evenings. You know, there was very important sort of times. And Terry is still a New York activist, you know, and bless her, she's also well into her 80s, but a fantastic woman, kind of not in the story as much as she should be, basically, right. You know, because, you know, I say, I mentioned Michael Gray, who's my favorite Dylan writer, but he's got an encyclopedia of Bob Dylan encyclopedia, which is almost 800 pages. Terry doesn't have an entry. It's like, kind of, you know, how can you not include these people? They are absolutely you know, integral to the Bob Dylan story, you know, and these were people I wanted in there. You know, these are the stories I wanted to tell.
Right.
And I, you know, got everything in I wanted, which was great.
That's good. And it's not like how many pages I got. I read it on the Kindle. So, you know, it's always, and if you'd had the hard copy here, I would have read the hard copy, but how many pages is it, Kevin or Keith?
160 pages.
So this is like, I read it over the weekend, you know?
Yeah.
It's just like a good thing. We could talk, and I will put in the show notes a link how you can buy this book and the website and all this stuff, because it's important. You know, this is a labor of love, but it's still labor. You should get paid for it. So, right. So I don't want to give away every story, but I just think, you know, when I was a kid growing up in Nebraska, I was a huge David Letterman fan. I used to stay up late. You know, my parents would think I went to bed, and then I would sneak down to the basement to watch Letterman in his first show on NBC. And there is this very funny classic story about Bob and these guys, they pick up bands. So I want you to kind of, since it's your story, tell the story a little bit, and then I had a funny little addendum.
I'm wearing the T-shirt.
Right.
I'm wearing the Dylan and the Plugs it was something I really wanted in the book because it's one of my favorite Bob Dylan moments. It's the most Bob Dylan story ever, in my view. You know, nothing encapsulates the guy like this particular episode. And I thought the publishers would say, well, look, that's what you can't have, you know, the Plugs on the Letterman show in the 80s as part of a guide, you know, but you know, I wanted not just the Greenwich Village stuff, you know, New York means, you know, the guide goes from Beacon Theatre to Beacon Theatre, you know, through the years, you know, it's important. And you know, the David Letterman show, I you know, it's an extraordinary story. I mean, a small trailer encapsulation, you know, is essentially, you know, the Plugs were a post-punk band that you know, Dylan's kids enjoyed, and you know, he'd picked these guys up. They'd done a little bit of rehearsal, no idea what they were going to do, and lo and behold, you know, suddenly in 84 they appear on the Letterman show, you know, in front of 8 gazillion people or whatever it is, you know.
He had
and
huge numbers. He was hugely popular.
You know, and essentially it's Bob Dylan and a pub band. You know, I mean, they're an extraordinary bunch. And you know, I titled the chapter "The Greatest Band You Never Saw" because the real shame is that they didn't know what was going to happen after that show. You know, I think Dylan and the Plugs on tour and how they'd have gone and how they'd have played that sort of that wonderful, you know, this like Echo and the Bunnymen. They were kind of, you know, it's taking Dylan to new levels with everything on one 3-song performance. And you know, I think it's it is the band we really lost to music history. I think they would have been so fantastic. You know, there is, if people read the book, there's Harmonica Gate in there, which is the most dramatic moment on live television since the moon landings. You know, I think this is so wonderful. I wanted Dylan and the Plugs to be in there, mostly so I could get a Dylan and the Plugs T-shirt out of it.
That's very nice. You know, yeah, read the book to get the missing harmonica story because it's fabulous. And then, you know, everything's on YouTube. Read it first, then watch the clip because then it's fun because it's up on YouTube. But you know, I'm reading the book, and then you say, well, they later became the Cruzados, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I saw them. And so I like started thinking, and actually they played at Farm Aid 3, 1987 in my hometown in Lincoln, Nebraska. Willie Nelson brought Farm Aid 3, which was, you know, talk about, you know, Arlo Guthrie was at Farm Aid 3. I'm trying to think who else was there. Neil Young was there, like all these people, kind of that's the same era people. But it was just funny. It's like when you said that, and I was like, I think I saw them, and I did. But the saddest part about it to me was, well, you know, good for them. They don't know what they're playing until the absolute last second, that's got to be terrifying. But then it's sad afterwards, like they're calling, like, so we doing anything, right? How many times did they call afterwards, wanting to see if this was going to go on?
I mean, I think the saddest part of the book, and there are many sad parts, is Charlie Quintana sitting by the phone waiting for it to ring back, and you know, it's like, you know, as I say, it would have been an extraordinary. You know, Dylan and the Plugs on a world tour would have been absolutely something else, you know, but it you know, I mean, the guys went on to have careers and kept going. I mean, we have lost 2 of them now, but you know, they went on in music, but not at the same. But you know, they must have looked back on that one night, you know, when they were extraordinary. And you know, I as you say, I want people to read the chapter, but then we've got even more rehearsal stuff that's come up on YouTube. But, you know, the performances from the Letterman show are, I think, are wonderful. You know, and yeah, I mean, you know, you can't get a more exciting sort of live TV performance than that, really. I think it's extraordinary. extraordinary. But
No, it's great.
I was delighted it went in the book. But fair
That was
play
my
to
favorite part for me personally.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, and you know, it was an extraordinary. But there is nothing more Dylan-esque than picking up a pub band and just doing all the Letterman show, you know, and then leaving it there, you know.
Right.
It's like...
So, a kid from South London. You said in the beginning of the book that you heard the greatest hits, which is, you know, that's the way that a lot of people hear it. And then it's kind of a shame because the greatest hits is not really what you really want to listen to when you listen to back then too. I mean, like albums were really well thought out, like, you know, from song to song to song. But I know that you love Bob Dylan a lot because you went to Tulsa, Oklahoma. It'd be like me going, I don't even know where I'd be in England. That would be the equivalent of Tulsa, Oklahoma to go visit.
I've no idea, to be honest. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere,
really. Right?
I mean, it was wonderful. It's like one of those extraordinary things that you know. I wanted to talk about Bob Dylan and Robert Graves, which is in the first book, Bob Dylan in London. You know, I wanted to tell the world what I'd found about that particular meeting. You know, and mostly because no one had bothered to look at it. No one had bothered to find out the square where they walked, and they had a discussion that's in Chronicles. You know, I mean, Bob Dylan's put this down, but, you know, he obviously got the name of the square wrong, as one does in Chronicles, you know, but, you know, you could find out, you know, and I bothered to find out. So I wanted to tell the Bob Dylan world that, you know, so it was wonderful to go to Tulsa, and, you know, I got to go into the archives, you know, which is fabulous. You know, they bring you out you know, a typed up like a Rolling Stone, and, you know, you sit there in reverence at these things, you know, and it was wonderful. But the greatest joy was being at a conference was with 500 Bob Dylan fans, you know, and spending the week not having to answer questions about whether he can sing or not and stuff
Right.
like that. You know, it's like we're all Bob Dylan fans. You start at a base of this is wonderful, and you know, it was a total joy. And I have good friends from the Tulsa conference times now, which is, it's been great. You know, go on to Dylan Twitter, you'll find them there.
Well, my story's not nearly as arduous as yours, but I don't know, 5-6 years. So the reason why I picked up the guitar and became a guitar player was because of Stevie Ray Vaughan. I saw Stevie Ray Vaughan in concert when I was 17, 16, and I was like, I want to do that. And then obviously he tragically died really young. I saw him 4 months before he died, and I just had heard, because it's the Woody Guthrie Center that's in Tulsa. That's why Tulsa, Oklahoma has this, because Woody was from Oklahoma. So let's preface it with that. But Jimmy Vaughn, Stevie's brother, is apparently friends with the curator, and all of Stevie's stuff, kind of like you said, you know, that how like there's the original lyrics, and Stevie Ray Vaughan, here's number one, the guitar that looked like shit that he played for years. It's amazing. And they were going to have it there and so we just drove down there. It's a 4-hour drive. I'm not a big, huge fan of Oklahoma. You know, it's not where I wouldn't vacation there for anything else. But to be fair, it's a really nice museum, and they did a fabulous job with it. It was very touching to see all these things that I hadn't seen in 30 years. So I could see once you got to Tulsa, it was probably great. But that's a little bit of a travel.
Yeah, no. I'm sorry, you know, I didn't have a lot of time other than the conference hour. I think you're right. I think Oklahoma is basically empty. You know, but when you get there at Tulsa, it was fun, and the archive and museum when it opens will be great. I mean, what I would say is that I think it's great for the real Bob Dylan fan. I don't know how the museum bit's going to be, because you've got a lot of, you know, the manuscripts and the notebooks and the stuff like that. You know, I think for a museum, for the average music fan, they'll go in there and they'll be thinking, well, where's the Rolling Thunder hat and the guitar from, you know, or the coat on the front of Freewheeling, you know, all that stuff that should be in a museum about someone isn't really there. So I don't know how it's going to work out as an actual museum, because it's paper.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, they're thinking they're going to see Graceland or, Prince's house up in Minnesota, and it's not going to be that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you wouldn't go to Graceland and not see Elvis's suits.
Right.
It's kind of a given, really. Whereas the Dylan archive is academic, if you like, in lots of ways. There are, there's film footage, but then you're not gonna, as a casual music fan going to a museum, sit through 20 hours of Eat the Document, are you? It doesn't work terribly well like that. So I think they've got quite a task to make it an attraction for people to come into Tulsa. I mean, you've got Woody Guthrie Center there, which is fine. And when you go into that one, you've got violins and hats,
right,
and stuff. You've got things,
right,
artifacts. That's what a museum really kind of needs. Whereas I think the archive is mostly lyrics, really.
Now, and then we'll wrap up here in a minute. But one of the other things I was thinking about is there been anybody who's been more covered than Bob Dylan, and not just by like third-rate people. I mean, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and I mean, like anybody. Obviously, Jimi Hendrix is the most famous example.
Yeah,
but it's like you hear songs all the time, right?
Yeah, which was one of the outtakes. I couldn't get into the Bob Dylan in London book because All Along the Watchtower was recorded at a studio in southwest London in Barnes, near where I grew up, which is still a wonderful. It's a cinema now, but you've got a lot of the old studio there, and the Stones and Who recorded there. But for me, Jimi Hendrix is All Along the Watchtower there. This is. I think it's one of the very few songs where both the original and the cover are bona fide classics. There's not many that totally fit. I mean, sure there are others, but not many that fit that bill. I mean, Dylan is covered by more people because his songs are better than anyone else's. Is a reality.
I think he's covered so much that I think a lot of time. So, and I'm talking lay people. I'm talking just a person. I'm not talking nerds like us that listen to music and dissect things. But I bet you a lot of people don't know Adele's hit. What was that? 10 years ago? Make You Feel My Love. I bet they didn't know that was a Dylan tune, right?
No, absolutely. And it's like I say, he has finer songs than anyone in my view, and they do cover quite well on lots of occasions. They really do. I think there's very few where I prefer the cover version to Dylan's version. One that I would point out to people to check out again when you're looking through YouTube for the Letterman show, have a look at a video of a song we mentioned earlier, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, which I think covers beautifully by a lot of people. But there's a version by the Rainbow Girls, which I came upon accidentally. But, you check out the Rainbow Girls doing Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. I think that's the most joyous thing I've ever seen in my life. It's like the most fun. And it's quite wonderful to hear that song that's about kind of failed relationship and sod you sort of thing, being sung by women as well. It's wonderful. But it's wonderfully refreshing to hear their version. So I would recommend that when people are on YouTube.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a ton of fun.
Absolutely.
I love the book, and not just because you and I were Twitter pals. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I will put in the show notes both books. Next time, I bet I was in London for 36 hours. I just crammed it in. We were in Edinburgh. I'm Scottish #1 ancestry, #2 is English, and so we took the train down, and I tried to get as much down. But I need to get back and just do like a week in London, and hopefully I'll time it when the world finally opens up again, and we can go to Crystal Palace and have a pint and do all that. That'd be cool.
We have a weekend that involves a win for the Palace and a pint at the Troubadour. that's going to happen, James. Don't worry.
No, I want it. Because 36. London's like New York in a lot of ways. There's so much. I mean, you could spend weeks there and see everything, right?
Yeah.
So I'm at the Tower of London and I'm like running around like an idiot for. There's no way. I mean, I would like to come back for a million reasons, but one of them just be kind of nice and leisurely about it, not having to run around. So
absolutely, we shall do that.
What's the pub that's right next to Selhurst Park? It's the cool one that you hang out. What's the name of it?
We tend to hang out at the Pawson's Arms, which is very fine. There is the Cherry Trees, which is a wonderful pub, and there's the Pawson's Arms. They're again, it's wonderful. Like sort of Dylan fans meeting up. The joy in going to Crystal Palace is quite often not the game. It's the before and after. And I say that seriously. It's quite often not the game.
It's like the Cubs for years. The Cubs, it was about going to Wrigley Field, and it's that the Cubs were terrible forever. Same kind of thing, but no,
absolutely. But there's a pint for you at the Pawson's and the Troubadour. Then
I'm up, dude. I'm down. You had me a pint. So last thing about that. So it's been interesting to me. There's all these people now in America who are paying attention to it for the first time simply because of Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
And I think they're filming some of the stuff at Selhurst Park.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, fabulous.
Because obviously the team that he's supposedly managing isn't real. And so, but it's just it's because I'm almost certain seeing the interior of the stadium that's where they're filming it.
Fabulous.
Yeah. And Mr. Sudeikis is from Kansas City. So.
Right. Well, you couldn't find a finer club to act as a backdrop to that.
Yeah, well, I hope they're charging Hollywood a lot, right? They need to be able to compete with the big boys. They need some money.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a total joy. I really appreciate it. I'll put in the show notes the link to both books.
Fabulous.
Do you want me to share your Twitter feed? Do you want all these schmoes to listen to my podcast?
Yeah, share the Twitter feed, and then, if people have got questions about anything, pester the life out of me. I'm constantly on there. I'm addicted to Twitter,
right.
Which I suppose is slightly better than cocaine, but I don't know. It's
cheaper.
Yeah, but yeah, do point people there because, as I say, it's nice, and you've got all sort of ranges of fan interest really there, so people can dip in and out, but if they've got questions, definitely, and again, like your good self, when people are over in London, we do the tours, we take people around the King and Queen and the Troubadour and the Savoy Steps, wonderful places, and I can't wait to get over to New York with a copy in the back. Both books are so you can put them in your back pocket,
right?
They're deliberately that guide size as well, which is important. So that would be very great to do sometime.
Well, when you do New York, let me know too, because we've got good friends there, so we go there before the pandemic. Quite
Wonderful.
a bit.
That will happen. We've got a lot planned for 2022.
Oh my God. Where's the wood? I want to knock on it. There, I'm knocking on the wood. All right, brother. It's really nice to talk to you. Love the book, and have a good night.
Cheers. Your good health. Take care. Thanks,
all right,
James.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Keith Miles, everybody. That was so much fun. Thanks so much to Keith. Yes, down in the show notes, there are links to both books, how you can buy them. Check them out. They are a fun, easy read. It's almost like kind of what I just did with Keith for the last hour. It's conversation, and he's a great storyteller. You're going to get a kick out of it. So that's going to do it for this time on Trading Force. We're back in 1 week. Until then, go out, support live music, and we'll talk real soon. Bye-bye.
train. But if I have to walk, I'm gonna get there just the same. I'm gonna Kansas City, Kansas City, here I come. They got a crazy way of loving there, and I'm gonna get me some. Oh yeah, they got a crazy way of loving there, and I'm gonna get me some. They got a crazy way of loving there, and I'm gonna get me some.